On warm evenings in San Telmo, one of the oldest neighborhoods in Buenos Aires, you can hear them. Drums. Not the polished percussion of a concert stage, not the mechanical beat of a recording studio. These are hand-struck drums, animal hide stretched over wood, 3 different sizes, playing 3 different rhythms that lock together into something far older than the cobblestone streets beneath the player's feet. The rhythm is called candombe. It comes from a Kikongo word meaning, roughly, pertaining to black people. And it has been played in these same streets, on and off, for over 400 years. The drums are warmed over open fires before they are played. That is not a metaphor. The players build actual fires in the street, hold the drum skins close to the flame until the leather tightens and the pitch rises, and then they march. The piano drum carries the bottom, deep, heavy, almost geological. The chico cuts through with rapid strikes. The repique calls and answers. Together they create a rhythm that does not invite you to listen. It commands your body to move. And when the comparsas, the drumming groups, set off through the narrow streets of San Telmo, people follow. They cannot help it. The sound is that old and that physical. The crowds gather without invitation. Lawyers and taxi drivers and teenagers fall in behind the comparsas and just walk, carried by a beat that seems to come from somewhere beneath the pavement. And something happens to people in that crowd. For a few blocks, in a city that moves fast and talks faster, everyone slows down. Everyone breathes together. It is hard to explain unless you have felt it. The rhythm reaches past the part of you that thinks and grabs the part of you that knows. Walk a few blocks from where those drums echo, and you will find tango halls, the dance Argentina exports to the world as its most cherished cultural symbol. Tourists come from every continent to learn the steps. Guides will tell you about the passion, the melancholy, the European elegance. What they rarely mention is that the word tango itself likely comes from the same African gathering places, called tangos, where enslaved people once danced in colonial Buenos Aires. The first copyrighted tango score, published in 1898, was written by an Afro-Argentine named Rosendo Mendizabal. The roots of Argentina's most famous art form run straight through the community that Argentina spent 2 centuries trying to erase. And I mean erase, not neglect, not overlook, erase. In 2018, the president of Argentina stood at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, and told assembled global leaders that the partnership between South America and Europe was natural because, in his words, in South America, we are all descendants of Europeans. He said this about a country where, just 200 years earlier, 1 in every 3 people walking the streets of Buenos Aires was black. 1 in 3. Not a small community, not a footnote in the margins. 1/3 of the capital city. And in some provinces, the numbers were even higher. A colonial census conducted in 1778 found that people of African descent made up 44% of Córdoba's population and 46% in Salta. In cities like Santiago del Estero and Catamarca, black and mixed-race residents were the majority. Enslaved people had been arriving in the Rio de la Plata region since the late 1500s. By the end of the colonial era, they were not a minor presence, they were a foundation. They worked the docks, they built the churches, they labored on the farms, they nursed the children of the families that owned them. They were bakers and bricklayers and laundresses and blacksmiths. And in what little time was their own, they built something extraordinary. By the late 1700s, enslaved and free black people in Buenos Aires had organized themselves into mutual aid societies called nations, each one connected to a specific African ethnic group or region of origin. These were not informal gatherings. They had elected leaders, collected dues, maintained funds to purchase the freedom of their members, and held regular assemblies. On Sundays and feast days, The nations would host public dances, and the streets of what is now San Telmo and Montserrat would fill with rhythms from Angola and the Congo, recreating for an afternoon something that the Atlantic crossing had tried to destroy. The authorities sometimes banned these gatherings. Sometimes they tolerated them. Sometimes they encouraged them, depending on the political winds. But the gatherings never fully stopped. The need to remember where you came from was stronger than any decree. And when the time came to fight for the nation's freedom, these same communities fought with everything they had. And then, according to the official story, they simply vanished. The explanations Argentines have given for this disappearance over the decades have become almost rehearsed. They were killed in the wars. There were never that many. They left. And, perhaps most tellingly, when visitors pointed to people who clearly had African features and asked about their background, the common response became a kind of reflexive deflection. "That's not black," they would say. "That's Southern Italian." I want to sit with that for a moment, because the discomfort inside that sentence, the need to reclassify a face rather than acknowledge what it carries, tells you more about what happened than any history textbook. The real story is not that Argentina's black population vanished. It is that Argentina decided they should, and then built a national identity around the lie that they had. It began with war. In the early 1800s, Argentina fought for its independence from Spain, and black soldiers formed a crucial part of the revolutionary armies. They fought at the front. They were disproportionately placed on the most dangerous lines. And one story, more than any other, shows what that service meant and what it cost. A woman named Maria Remedios del Valle, born into the Pardo community of Buenos Aires around 1768, volunteered with her husband and both of her children to join the Army of the North. She was not there to wash bandages. She fought on the battlefield. She tended the wounded between engagements. She was captured by Spanish forces after the Battle of Ayohuma in 1813, one of the bloodiest defeats of the Independence War, and was publicly flogged as punishment. She escaped. Her husband had been killed. Both of her children had been killed. She had nothing left except the cause, and she went back to it. General Manuel Belgrano, the man whose name is synonymous with Argentine independence, personally gave her the rank of captain. Her fellow soldiers called her La Capitana. When the war ended, when the country she had bled and lost everything for was free, nobody came for her. No pension arrived. No ceremony honored her sacrifice. She submitted a claim for compensation in 1826. It was denied. She grew old, grew ill, and survived by begging for food at the doors of convents in Buenos Aires. Years later, a general who had fought beside her stumbled upon her on the streets, barely alive, and was so horrified that he petitioned the legislature to grant her a pension. She received it. She lived quietly on it for the last decade of her life. She died in 1847. For the next 150 years, the nation she had helped create forgot she existed. They called her Madre de la Patria, the mother of the homeland, eventually. But only after 21st century historians began pulling her story out of archives where it had been buried, alongside everything else, Argentina did not want to remember about its black population. In 2022, her face was placed on the Argentine banknote. 175 years after she died begging on the streets of the country she helped liberate. Her story breaks my heart, not because it is unusual, but because it is representative. What happened to Maria Remedios del Valle happened, in slower and less dramatic ways, to an entire people. After the Wars of Independence came more wars. The War of the Triple Alliance against Paraguay, from 1864 to 1870, was one of the most devastating conflicts in South American history. Paraguay lost an estimated 200,000 people. Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay ground that country nearly into extinction. And within the Argentine forces, black soldiers bore a disproportionate share of the fighting and dying. This was not an accident of demographics. Black men were actively recruited, sometimes forcibly, into military service. The pattern repeated across decades of conflict, from the independence wars, through the civil wars, through the Paraguayan campaign. Each war chewed through the same communities. Each war left fewer black men and more black widows. And over time, the survivors, mostly women, married into the growing European immigrant population. Not always by choice, often because there was simply no one left. But the wars alone do not explain what happened. Not even close, because then came something worse than any battlefield. In January of 1871, 3 cases of yellow fever were diagnosed in San Telmo, the same neighborhood where candombe drums still echo today. The disease had arrived with soldiers returning from Paraguay. The city commission was warned. They dismissed the warnings. The carnival festivities proceeded as planned. The city of Buenos Aires, 180,000 people packed into a plane with no drainage system and no running water, became a death trap. At its peak, 500 people were dying every day. A newspaper called La Tribuna wrote that the streets were so dark at night, so emptied of life, that it truly appeared as if the terrible scourge had swept away all the residents. The dead accumulated faster than wagons could carry them. Coffins piled up at cemetery gates. A new cemetery, Chacarita, had to be built, and a railway line extended to transport the bodies. It became known as the Train of Death. The wealthy fled north, abandoning their grand homes in San Telmo and Montserrat, which were promptly converted into tenement housing. The poor, overwhelmingly black and immigrant, had nowhere to go. They could not afford to leave. Over 13,000 people died. Entire blocks were emptied. The southern neighborhoods, the black neighborhoods, were gutted. An artist named Juan Manuel Blanes painted a scene from that epidemic that I think about more than I should. It shows a woman, dead of the fever, lying across the floor of a tenement room. Her baby, still alive, is reaching for her breast. Her husband's body lies on a bed behind her. The door is open, and 2 members of the Relief Commission are stepping inside to discover this horror. Both of those relief workers would themselves die of the fever within weeks. The painting became a kind of memorial. But what it captured, in one frozen frame, was the reality of thousands of families in those southern neighborhoods who had no one coming to save them. And after the epidemic, the wealthy never came back to San Telmo. They built new neighborhoods in the north of the city, reshaping Buenos Aires into a geography of class that persists to this day. The old black quarters, hollowed out by disease, were filled instead by the wave of European immigration that was about to reshape Argentina forever. Because the dying was not enough. What came next was deliberate. The 1853 Constitution was written with European immigration explicitly in mind. Its architects saw the future of Argentina as a white future, and they built the legal framework to make it happen. President Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, who governed from 1868 to 1874, was perhaps the most vocal architect of this vision. He did not hide his contempt for Argentina's black and indigenous populations. He saw European immigration as the cure for what he called the barbarism of the country's non-white inhabitants, and he acted on that belief with the full machinery of the state. Beginning in the 1850s and accelerating dramatically after 1880, Argentina launched one of the most ambitious demographic engineering projects in modern history. They called it blanqueamiento, whitening. The government subsidized passage for European immigrants, offered them land, gave them settlement incentives, all with the explicit ideological goal of diluting the country's African and indigenous heritage and constructing a European nation in South America. This was not a quiet social trend. It was state policy. Between 1857 and 1950, roughly 6.5 million Europeans arrived, mostly from Italy and Spain. To put that in perspective, Argentina's total population in 1869 was only 1.8 million. They tripled the population with European immigrants. By 1914, half the people living in Buenos Aires had been born in Europe. And the census helped finish the job. Rather than using terms like pardo or moreno, categories that acknowledged African descent, census takers were instructed to use words like trigueño, meaning wheat-colored, a term vague enough to reclassify dark-skinned people as something other than black. In 1887, the official black population of Buenos Aires was recorded at just under 2%. After that, racial categories were removed from the Argentine national census entirely. For over 100 years, the government simply stopped counting. And if you do not count a people, they become, statistically, invisible. And if they are invisible long enough, the country begins to believe they were never there at all. The myth fed on its own silence. School children learned that Argentina was a European nation. History books told the story of immigration and progress. The Afro-Argentine chapters were left blank, and after enough years of blankness, people stopped wondering what had been on those pages. A magazine called Caras y Caretas captured the spirit of that era in 1905 with a sentence I cannot stop thinking about. Writing about the apparent decline of the black population, the author celebrated it by declaring that the race was fading, dissolving, lightening. An African tree, the article said, was producing white flowers. They were proud. This was not grief. This was not observation. This was celebration. The project was working, and the architects of erasure believed they had succeeded. But the thing about blood is that it does not read magazines. It does not respond to policy. It does not vanish because a census says it should. If stories like this one matter to you, if you believe the gap between what nations tell themselves and what the evidence shows deserves to be explored, consider subscribing. There is so much more to uncover. When geneticist Daniel Korak and his team at the University of Buenos Aires began analyzing the DNA of modern Argentines, they were not looking for a lost people. They were building a forensic reference database, collecting hundreds of samples from across the country, testing autosomal markers, Y-chromosomal DNA, mitochondrial DNA, the standard toolkit of modern population genetics. But what the data told them became something else entirely. On average, across all their samples, roughly 4% of Argentine autosomal DNA traced back to sub-Saharan Africa. 4% might sound modest, but in a country that had spent over a century declaring itself entirely European, 4% is a ghost that will not leave the house. And when they looked at the details, the picture deepened. The Y chromosome, which passes through the male line, showed almost no African contribution, less than 1%. The male lineages had been effectively severed, but the mitochondrial DNA, which passes through the maternal line, told a different story. And the X chromosome, which carries a stronger signal from mothers and grandmothers, revealed a considerably larger African genetic presence than the autosomal average alone would suggest. The pattern pointed to something specific and painful. African women had been absorbed into the expanding European population through intermarriage, and often through unions that were anything but free choices. Their sons carried European surnames. Their daughters married European men. Generation by generation, the visible markers of African descent became less pronounced. But the code, the molecular record, did not fade. It passed forward. This is where the science becomes unbearably human. Because what the chromosomes are telling us is a story about women. About African and Afro-Argentine women whose male relatives had been killed in wars, or who found themselves in a country flooding with European men and emptying of black men, and who had children with those newcomers. Sometimes willingly, sometimes not. But in every case, their contribution to the next generation was recorded in the DNA. The European surname survived. The African grandmother was forgotten. But her mitochondrial DNA, the genetic inheritance that passes only from mother to child, did not forget. It kept going. Through every generation that did not know her name, her biological signature traveled forward anyway. A separate study, conducted by researchers at the University of Brasilia, found that the average African genetic contribution in the Argentine population was closer to 9%. 9%. In a country whose president had just stood before the world and declared that South Americans are all descended from Europeans. And other research found that the African ancestry was not evenly distributed across individuals. A study of Buenos Aires found that the African genetic component was concentrated, that roughly 10% of the city's population showed notably higher levels of African ancestry than the average. Which means these are not trace fragments scattered evenly across everyone. There are families, communities, neighborhoods where the African inheritance is substantial. They just do not know it. Think about what that means for a moment. Millions of Argentines, people who identify as white, people whose families have told them for generations that they descend entirely from Italy or Spain, carry within their cells the genetic signature of African ancestors they were never told about. The ancestry is not distant or debatable. It is measurable. It is there. Written in the code, passing from parent to child, surviving every attempt to erase it. And here is where it becomes something more than a scientific curiosity. In 2010, Argentina reintroduced a question about African ancestry to the national census for the first time in over a century. Only 0.37% of the population identified as Afro-Argentine. In 2022, an improved version of the question, the first truly universal one in Argentine history, raised that number to 0.66%. That is roughly 300,000 people willing to claim the identity out loud. Government estimates have suggested the actual number of Argentines with significant African ancestry could exceed 2 million. The gap between those two numbers, between who people say they are and what their cells carry, is the direct, measurable legacy of blanqueamiento. It is not that the people are gone, it is that they were taught, over generations, to not recognize what they are. A century of social pressure, discrimination, and the relentless construction of an all-white national identity produced a population that carries African ancestry but cannot claim it. In many cases, does not even know it. Over 5% of Argentines report having at least one black ancestor. Another 20% say they simply do not know. That uncertainty alone is a wound. 20% of a country unable to answer the question, where do I come from? That is not forgetfulness. That is the long echo of a policy designed to make people unknowable to themselves. I think about a person sitting in Buenos Aires today, someone who looks in the mirror and sees European features, who grew up hearing they were Italian and Spanish, who feels Argentine in the way Argentines feel Argentine. And somewhere inside their cells, there is a woman from Angola or a man from the Congo who crossed the Atlantic in chains 400 years ago, whose name was never written down, whose story was never told, but whose biology refused to disappear. That person exists. They are not hypothetical. They are millions. The erasure was never just about bodies. It was about identity. And a nation can erase an identity far more thoroughly than it can erase a people. But the body refuses, and so does the culture, if you know where to listen. In the 1880s, at the height of the so-called disappearance, there were roughly 20 black published newspapers circulating in Buenos Aires alone. 20. They discussed unemployment, European immigration, social justice, and community gatherings. They ran editorials about the political marginalization of their readers. They debated the impact of the new immigration wave on their communities. They advertised social events and mutual aid meetings. Some researchers believe these Afro-Argentine social movements were among the earliest expressions of socialist ideas in Argentine culture. Think about that for a moment. At the exact time the nation was declaring them extinct, they were running 20 newspapers. They had printing presses, they had editors, they had readers, they had a public conversation about their future. This was not a dying community whimpering into silence. This was a community being told it was dead while it was still very much alive, still organizing, still debating, still writing its own story. The nation just was not reading it. And in the music, the refusal to vanish was loudest of all. A dance historian writing anonymously in 1913 described how, in 1877, a group of Afro-Argentines created a new dance that they specifically called tango. It grew from the candombe rhythms brought from Angola, fused with milonga from the Pampas, and absorbed the habanera rhythms arriving from Cuba. The dance halls where it was born, in San Telmo and La Boca, were the spaces where Black, immigrant, and Criollo cultures collided. The first tango musicians were disproportionately Afro-Argentine. Casimiro Alcorta, a Black violinist, and Sinforoso, a mulatto clarinetist, formed what many consider the first tango ensemble, performing from the 1870s through the 1890s. And then, the tango was whitened too. It traveled a remarkable journey. From the poor neighborhoods of the South, it climbed into the salons of the Buenos Aires middle class. From there, it crossed the Atlantic to Paris, where it became a sensation in the years before the First World War. European aristocrats and Argentine elites danced it in ballrooms, and that European legitimacy was the passport the tango needed to be accepted back home by the very classes that had once dismissed it as vulgar. By the 1940s, every prominent tango artist was white. The African roots were acknowledged less and less. Tango researchers note that after the dance's decline in the mid-20th century and its later rediscovery, a revisionist approach took hold where the African origins were simply no longer recognized. The connection to candombe, to the gathering places called tangos, to the Afro-Argentine musicians who first put bow to string and finger to key, all of it faded from the popular narrative. Argentina's most famous cultural export became, in the popular imagination, European. A dance born in African gathering places, carried by rhythms from the Congo and Angola, named with a word that may itself have African roots, became the symbol of a nation that told itself it had no black people. This is the part I keep coming back to, not the statistics, not the genetic percentages. This, the most celebrated thing Argentina ever gave the world, was created by the very people it spent 2 centuries trying to forget. That is not a historical footnote. That is a mirror. And the question it raises is not really about Argentina at all, because every nation has its version of this story. Every country has people it built itself upon and then wrote out of the narrative. What Argentina shows us, with unusual and painful clarity, is that the writing out never fully works. The code is too stubborn, the rhythms are too old, the body carries what the mouth denies. And today, something is shifting. In San Telmo and La Boca, the comparsas are growing. Young Argentines who never thought of themselves as having African roots are joining candombe groups. Afro-Argentine cultural organizations are pushing for visibility, for accurate history in schools, for the kind of recognition that does not stop at a single holiday or a face on a banknote. It is slow. It is incomplete. But it is happening. A candombero from San Telmo, someone who has spent years teaching this rhythm to anyone willing to learn, once said something in an interview that I cannot stop thinking about. He said, "African culture goes far beyond skin color. There are people with blonde hair and blue eyes who identify and rediscover themselves in Mother Africa, which is the origin of all humanity." He is right. And the DNA proves it. In November of 2013, Argentina declared the 8th of November as the National Day of Afro-Argentines and African Culture. The date honors the death of Maria Remedios del Valle, the woman who gave her family, her health, and her youth to a nation that left her to beg, now has a national holiday. There is something both beautiful and painful in that. Beautiful because recognition matters, because names pulled from silence begin to heal what silence did. Painful because it came 166 years after she died, and only after the nation's own DNA had already proven what she could have told them all along. She was there. They were all there. They built the armies, they worked the land, they shaped the music, they raised the children, they lived and died and were buried under the cobblestones of San Telmo. And when the nation declared them vanished, they did not vanish. They married. They had children. They passed their code forward, one generation to the next, quiet and patient, until a technology was invented that could finally read what was always there. The African tree did not produce white flowers. It produced an Argentine tree, with roots so deep that no census, no policy, no war, and no epidemic could pull them out. And on warm evenings, in the oldest neighborhood in Buenos Aires, the drums still play. What part of your own country's history do you think the DNA might tell differently than the textbooks?